The true value of a meal is revealed only when you're hungry enough to keep it, and kind enough to give it away. The woman stood quietly at the corner food cart, her gray hoodie blending into the chilly autumn afternoon as people hurried past without noticing her. She reached into the pocket of her faded jeans and counted the coins resting in her palm. A quarter. 2 dimes. 3 pennies. The vendor watched patiently before giving a sympathetic shake of his head. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "You're still short." She smiled politely, embarrassed but composed, and closed her hand around the coins. "That's okay," she whispered. "Maybe next time." She stepped away from the counter before anyone else in line could look at her for too long. Hunger was uncomfortable. Pity was worse. Just a few feet away, Garrett Sullivan sat on a weathered wooden bench beside his 9-year-old daughter, Chloe. Autumn leaves drifted across the small city park while the cool breeze carried the smell of grilled sandwiches from the food cart. Garrett unwrapped a simple paper bag and carefully placed its contents on the bench between them. 1 turkey sandwich. 1 small apple. 1 bottle of water. It wasn't much, but after his work hours had been reduced again that morning, it was everything he could afford until payday. Chloe smiled anyway. "It smells really good, Dad." Garrett smiled back. "Everything tastes better when you're hungry." Chloe laughed softly, unaware of the quiet truth hidden inside his joke. Garrett reached for the sandwich and began cutting it neatly in half using a plastic knife he had saved from another lunch weeks earlier. Before he could hand Chloe her piece, he noticed the woman standing several yards away. She wasn't begging. She wasn't asking anyone for help. She simply stood there looking toward the food cart for a second longer than someone who had already accepted disappointment. Garrett watched her lower her eyes before turning away. Chloe noticed him watching. "Is she okay?" she asked. Garrett didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the sandwich resting in his hands. 1 half would fill Chloe's stomach. The other half was supposed to get him through the rest of the afternoon. His shift at the apartment complex wouldn't end for another 6 hours. He quietly folded the sandwich back together. Then he stood. Chloe looked up with curious blue eyes but said nothing. She had seen that expression on her father's face before. It always appeared right before he helped someone. Garrett walked toward the woman with slow, unhurried steps. "Excuse me," he said gently. She turned, surprised that anyone had spoken to her. "I think you forgot your lunch." A faint smile crossed her face. "No," she replied. "I just couldn't afford one today." Garrett looked at the paper bag in his hands for one silent moment before holding it out to her. "Then maybe today it's yours." The woman stared at him, unable to believe what she was seeing. "I can't take your food." Garrett shrugged lightly. "You can." She looked past him and noticed Chloe sitting alone on the bench, smiling as though sharing was the most ordinary thing in the world. The woman accepted the paper bag with trembling hands, completely unaware that this quiet stranger had just given away the last full meal he had planned to eat that day. Garrett simply smiled, turned around, and walked back toward his daughter without asking her name, without expecting thanks, and without knowing that the woman holding his lunch was Audrey Bennett, the CEO of one of the largest food companies in America. Earlier that same morning, Audrey Bennett had left behind everything that usually announced her arrival long before she entered a room. The chauffeured sedan stayed inside the company's underground garage. Her executive assistant, Michael Carter, reluctantly watched as she removed an elegant navy business suit and changed into a faded gray hoodie, a plain white t-shirt, worn blue jeans, and old sneakers she had purchased from a thrift store the week before. She tied her blonde hair into a loose ponytail and washed away every trace of makeup until the confident face that appeared on magazine covers each month became almost unrecognizable. Michael folded his arms. "You don't have to do this." Audrey zipped her hoodie halfway and smiled faintly. "That's exactly why I do." He looked unconvinced. "You can study customer behavior through reports." Audrey shook her head. "Reports tell me numbers. They never tell me how people feel." Before leaving, she handed Michael her phone, wallet, luxury watch, and company access badge. He stared at the small pile resting in his hands. How much money are you taking? Audrey reached into a coffee mug on the counter and pulled out a few coins. Whatever this buys. Michael sighed. That's barely enough for lunch. Audrey looked toward the office windows overlooking the city. Then maybe I'll finally understand what lunch means. Meanwhile, across town, Garrett Sullivan was ending a conversation he had hoped never to have. The maintenance supervisor at the apartment complex avoided eye contact as he handed Garrett a revised work schedule. I'm sorry, he said. Corporate reduced the maintenance budget again. Garrett unfolded the paper. His weekly hours had been cut by nearly a third. He quietly calculated the difference without using a calculator. Rent. Utilities. Chloe's school supplies. Winter jackets. The numbers refused to cooperate. We'll restore everyone's hours when occupancy improves, the supervisor added. Garrett simply nodded. I understand. He didn't argue because there was no one left to argue with. As he walked toward the employee locker room, another maintenance worker muttered, You should apply for assistance. Garrett smiled politely. Maybe someday. He never explained why he kept refusing. Pride had little to do with it. He simply believed there were always families struggling even more than his own. That afternoon, he picked Chloe up from school. She ran into his arms carrying a drawing of colorful autumn trees. Look, Dad! Mrs. Collins hung mine on the classroom wall. Garrett studied every crayon line as though it belonged in an art museum. I think she picked the best one. Chloe beamed. She had no idea her father had spent the last hour wondering how to stretch the week's grocery budget. On the walk toward the park, she slipped her small hand into his. Are we still having our picnic? Garrett smiled without hesitation. Of course. The picnic had become their tradition every Friday after school, even when all they could afford was one simple sandwich. Chloe never complained because Garrett never allowed scarcity to feel like disappointment. To her, sitting beside her father beneath the golden autumn trees was a celebration, not a compromise. Neither of them noticed Audrey Bennett walking the same sidewalks only a few blocks away, quietly discovering how invisible an ordinary person could become. They lived in completely different worlds, separated by wealth beyond imagination. Yet before the afternoon ended, hunger would bring them to the same wooden bench, where neither fortune nor status would matter as much as one simple decision made by a father who believed kindness should never depend on what someone could give in return. Audrey did not eat the sandwich immediately. She stood beneath a maple tree near the edge of the park, holding the paper bag with both hands as though it contained something too valuable to open. Garrett had already returned to the bench. He sat beside Chloe, unscrewed the cap from their single bottle of water, and handed it to her first. Audrey watched him take nothing for himself. That detail stayed with her. Most people who gave expected to be seen giving. Garrett had already turned away. She walked slowly toward the bench. Excuse me, she said. Garrett looked up. Chloe smiled at her before he could answer. Audrey held out the paper bag. I appreciate what you did, but I can't take all of this. Garrett leaned back slightly. You already did. Your daughter needs lunch. Chloe shook her head. Dad gave me the apple. She lifted it proudly from her lap. Audrey looked at Garrett. And what are you eating? I'm not very hungry. The answer came too quickly. Chloe looked at him with the quiet honesty children rarely learn to hide. You said you hadn't eaten since breakfast. Garrett gave her a small look. Chloe lowered her eyes toward the apple. Audrey almost smiled, but the expression never fully arrived. Instead, she sat at the far end of the bench, leaving enough space to make refusal unnecessary. Then we should divide it, she said. Garrett started to object. Chloe spoke first. That's what Dad always says. Audrey turned toward her. What does he say? Chloe carefully twisted the apple stem between her fingers. That food tastes better when nobody eats alone. Garrett looked away toward the path. It was something he had told her after her mother died, during the months when dinners at home had become too quiet for either of them to bear. He had never expected her to remember it. Audrey opened the paper bag. The sandwich was still warm. She separated it into 2 uneven pieces and offered the larger half to Garrett. He shook his head. She exchanged it for the smaller one. "This isn't charity," she said. "It's lunch." Garrett studied her for a moment, then accepted it. They ate without introductions. Around them, bicycles passed, leaves scraped across the pavement, and distant traffic moved through the city with complete indifference. Audrey noticed the careful way Garrett tore off a small corner of bread and gave it to Chloe, even though she already had the apple. She noticed his work boots, scratched at the toes, and the dark grease beneath one thumbnail that repeated washing had not removed. "What kind of work do you do?" she asked. "Building maintenance." "Do you like it?" Garrett considered the question. "I like fixing things before people realize they're broken." Audrey looked down at the sandwich. "That sounds useful. Usually invisible." "Those aren't the same thing." Their eyes met for the first time without caution. Garrett saw a tired woman in worn clothing who spoke like someone accustomed to being heard. Audrey saw a man with almost nothing who carried himself as though generosity had never made him poorer. Both sensed that the other was not exactly what appearances suggested. Neither asked for an explanation. Chloe finished her apple and searched inside her coat pocket. She pulled out a small oatmeal cookie wrapped in clear plastic, saved from school. Without ceremony, she broke it into 3 pieces. One for herself. One for her father. One for Audrey. Audrey accepted hers with a smile that trembled at the edges. It was the smallest part of the meal. Somehow, it was the one she would remember longest. The afternoon grew colder as long shadows stretched across the park. Garrett brushed the crumbs from his hands and stood, glancing at the old watch on his wrist. "I need to get back to work," he said softly. Chloe slipped her small hand into his without complaint. Fridays were her favorite afternoons, but she had learned long ago that grown-ups sometimes had places they couldn't avoid. Audrey rose from the bench as well, still holding the folded paper bag that had carried the sandwich. Somehow, she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. It felt less like wrapping paper and more like proof that genuine kindness still existed. "Thank you," she said once more. Garrett smiled politely. "Take care of yourself." It was such a simple sentence. Yet Audrey realized it had been spoken without curiosity, expectation, or judgment. He hadn't asked where she lived. He hadn't wondered why she had no money. He hadn't looked for a reason to decide whether she deserved help. He had simply cared because she needed it. Chloe waved cheerfully. "Bye." Audrey waved back. "Goodbye, Chloe." Father and daughter disappeared slowly down the sidewalk lined with maple trees until they blended into the afternoon crowd. Audrey remained standing where they had left her. A black SUV rolled quietly to the curb across the street but stopped far enough away not to attract attention. Michael Carter stepped out only after checking that no one nearby seemed interested. He crossed the street with visible relief. "Are you all right?" Audrey nodded. "Better than all right." Michael handed her a warm coat, but she didn't put it on immediately. "You were supposed to observe," he said. "Instead, someone fed you." Audrey looked down at the paper bag. "Not someone," she corrected him gently. "A father who barely had enough for himself." Michael studied her face. He had worked beside Audrey for 7 years and knew exactly when something had changed. "Should I arrange a reward?" Audrey shook her head immediately. "No." "A donation?" "No." "Anonymous financial assistance?" Audrey remained silent for several seconds before answering. "If kindness only receives money, eventually people begin believing kindness is a transaction." Michael frowned thoughtfully. "Then what do you want me to do?" Audrey finally put on the warm coat and looked back toward the empty bench. "Find him." Michael reached for his tablet. "Name?" "I never asked." "Address?" "Don't know." "Occupation?" Audrey smiled faintly. "Building maintenance." Michael sighed with a hint of amusement. "That narrows it down to several thousand people." Audrey laughed quietly for the first time that day. "Then start with the park security cameras." Michael nodded, already making notes. Anything else? Audrey looked again at the half-cookie Chloe had insisted she keep. It remained untouched in her pocket, wrapped inside the small piece of plastic. Yes, she said softly. Don't tell him who I am. Michael looked surprised. Why? Audrey's eyes remained fixed on the path where Garrett and Chloe had disappeared. Because I don't want to discover how he treats a CEO. She paused before continuing. I want to discover who he really is when he believes no one important is watching. As they drove away, Audrey rested the paper bag carefully beside her instead of throwing it into the trash. Across the city, Garrett climbed onto the roof of another apartment building to repair a broken ventilation unit, while Chloe finished her homework in the maintenance office below. Neither of them noticed that, somewhere behind the glass walls of one of America's largest corporations, a quiet search had just begun, not for an employee, not for an investor, but for a man whose greatest qualification was giving away the only meal he had planned to eat. The search began the next morning with almost no information to guide it. Michael Carter sat inside the security office of Bennett Foods headquarters, watching footage collected from the small city park. The image was grainy, but the moment itself was unmistakable. A maintenance worker in a faded flannel shirt stood before a woman in a gray hoodie and quietly handed her a paper bag containing his lunch. Michael replayed the scene 3 times. Garrett never hesitated. He never looked around to see who was watching. He simply gave away what little he had, then walked back to his daughter as though kindness required no applause. Freeze it there, Audrey said. Michael paused the video just as Garrett smiled at Chloe after returning to the bench. Audrey leaned closer to the screen. Look at his face. Michael nodded. He doesn't look like someone expecting gratitude. Exactly. She folded her arms. He acted as though helping someone was the normal thing to do. Michael spent the rest of the morning following one clue after another. Park surveillance captured Garrett and Chloe leaving together. Traffic cameras showed them walking toward a nearby apartment complex. Employee records from the property management company eventually revealed his name, Garrett Sullivan, maintenance technician, employed for nearly 11 years. Michael opened the personnel file. Nothing remarkable appeared at first glance. No promotions. No disciplinary actions. No awards. Just years of steady work. Then he noticed something unusual buried inside the notes section. 3 years earlier, Garrett had returned an envelope containing several $1,000s that a tenant had accidentally left behind after moving out. The owner had insisted on offering a reward. Garrett declined it. 2 years later, he found expensive jewelry during a plumbing repair and personally delivered it back to an elderly resident before anyone even realized it was missing. Again, he refused compensation. Michael continued reading. Last winter, Garrett had voluntarily covered emergency maintenance shifts for an injured coworker without requesting overtime approval. His supervisor had written only one sentence. Reliable beyond expectation. Michael quietly closed the file and walked into Audrey's office. She looked up from her desk. Well? He placed the folder in front of her. You were right. Audrey opened it slowly. About what? He wasn't kind because you were there. Audrey read every page without speaking. The records described a man who had spent years making small, unnoticed choices that consistently placed other people ahead of himself. No newspaper had ever written about him. No company had celebrated him. His kindness existed entirely outside the spotlight. Audrey closed the folder and looked through the office window toward the city below. What about his family? Michael hesitated. His wife passed away several years ago after an illness. He's raising Chloe alone. Audrey lowered her eyes. That explains the little girl. Michael nodded. There's something else. He handed her another report. His work hours were reduced this week. Audrey scanned the document. Less income. Higher expenses. No complaints filed. No requests for assistance. She slowly set the papers aside. So the meal he gave me. Michael finished the sentence quietly. was probably the only full meal he planned to eat that afternoon. Silence settled across the office. Audrey remembered the sandwich, the shared cookie, and Garrett's effortless smile. She had spent years interviewing executives, investors, and industry leaders, searching for people with integrity. Yet she had found more character on a weathered park bench than in many corporate boardrooms. Finally, she spoke. "Arrange a meeting." Michael reached for his notebook. "Should I tell him the CEO wants to see him?" Audrey smiled gently and shook her head. "No. Invite him for what he believes is an ordinary job interview." She looked once more at Garrett's employee file before closing it with quiet certainty. "I don't want to reward a good deed." She paused. "I want to discover whether the man behind that deed is exactly who I think he is." Garrett almost declined the invitation. The email arrived late Monday afternoon, while he was replacing a leaking water valve beneath the basement of Building C. His hands were covered in grease when his supervisor called down the hallway. "Garrett, you've got something from Bennett Foods." Garrett wiped his hands on an old shop towel before opening the message on the office computer. The company was launching a new community outreach division and wanted to interview candidates with experience in leadership and public service. He read the email twice before looking over his shoulder. "I think they sent this to the wrong person." His supervisor leaned closer to the screen. "Looks real to me." Garrett laughed quietly. "I've never managed anyone except a broken boiler. Maybe they see something you don't." Garrett thanked him but remained unconvinced. On the walk home, he folded the printed invitation into his jacket pocket without mentioning it. That evening, Chloe noticed the envelope while setting the dinner table. Their meal was simple: vegetable soup, slices of bread, and tea, but she smiled as if it were a holiday feast. "What's that?" she asked. Garrett hesitated before handing her the letter. Chloe read slowly, sounding out the longer words. When she reached the end, her eyes widened. "Dad, they're inviting you to an interview." Garrett stirred his soup. "Probably just one of those automated recruiting emails." Chloe shook her head so quickly that a strand of blonde hair fell across her face. "It has your name." Garrett smiled. "That doesn't mean they'll want me after they meet me." Chloe folded the letter carefully. "I think they already do." He looked at his daughter across the small kitchen table. Children had a remarkable way of believing in possibilities that adults quietly abandoned years earlier. "What if I embarrass myself?" he asked with a grin. Chloe answered without hesitation. "Then you'll embarrass yourself kindly." Garrett laughed harder than he had in weeks. Across the city, Audrey sat in a conference room reviewing resumes submitted for executive positions. None held her attention for long. Her thoughts repeatedly drifted back to Garrett Sullivan. "Has he accepted?" she asked. Michael checked his phone. "Not yet." Audrey closed another folder. "He may think he isn't qualified." "Technically," Michael began carefully, "his resume doesn't match the position." Audrey looked at him. "Neither does most of corporate leadership." Michael smiled despite himself. "Fair point." Audrey stood and walked toward the window overlooking the company's manufacturing campus. Hundreds of employees moved between buildings below, each carrying responsibilities invisible to everyone else. "Titles tell me what people do," she said quietly. "Character tells me who they are." Michael nodded. "Should I call him personally?" Audrey considered it before shaking her head. "No. If he comes, it has to be because he believes he has something worthwhile to offer, not because the CEO asked." The following morning, Garrett finally clicked the confirmation link. One interview. Thursday morning. Business attire requested. He stared at the last line for several seconds before opening his bedroom closet. Inside hung only one suit, carefully protected inside a thin plastic garment bag. It had been worn exactly twice, once on his wedding day, and once at his wife's funeral. Garrett gently removed it and brushed away a layer of dust. Chloe appeared in the doorway without making a sound. "You're going to wear Mom's favorite tie," she said softly. Garrett looked down at the blue tie still hanging neatly beside the suit. His fingers rested on the fabric for a long moment. Then he smiled. Yeah, he whispered. I think I will. Neither father nor daughter realized that this interview had never been about qualifications, experience, or a job description. It was quietly becoming the moment when a simple act of kindness would finally meet the truth waiting patiently behind a familiar smile. Thursday morning arrived with crisp autumn air and a sky washed clean by the night's rain. Garrett stood in front of the small mirror inside his apartment, adjusting the blue tie that had once been his wife's favorite. The suit fit a little looser than it had years ago, but Chloe smiled as though she were looking at the most important man in the world. You look handsome, Dad. Garrett laughed softly. The suit deserves most of the credit. Chloe stepped closer and straightened one side of his collar with surprising seriousness. No, she whispered. You do. Before leaving, Garrett knelt beside her. Mrs. Henderson will pick you up after school, okay? Chloe nodded. Are you nervous? He thought for a moment before answering honestly. A little. She slipped something into his jacket pocket. Then take this. Garrett reached inside after she hugged him goodbye. It was the remaining half of the oatmeal cookie she had saved from several days earlier, still carefully wrapped in clear plastic. A small handwritten note rested beside it. It read, Kind people belong everywhere. Garrett smiled to himself before walking toward the bus stop. Across the city, Bennett Foods headquarters reflected the morning sunlight like polished glass. Employees hurried through the revolving doors carrying laptops, coffee cups, and presentation folders. Garrett paused outside the entrance for a brief moment, suddenly aware that his worn leather shoes had been polished 3 times before leaving home, yet still looked older than everyone else's. He took a quiet breath and walked inside. The receptionist greeted him warmly. Good morning. Name? Garrett Sullivan. She checked her schedule. Mr. Sullivan, welcome. Someone will escort you upstairs shortly. Everything felt larger than he expected. The marble floors, the towering windows, the quiet confidence of people walking through the lobby. Yet no one looked down on him. That surprised him most. Meanwhile, on the executive floor, Audrey stood inside her office wearing the navy suit she had set aside a week earlier. Her blonde hair was neatly styled, and the quiet woman in the gray hoodie had disappeared behind the composed confidence recognized throughout the business world. Michael entered carrying a tablet. He's here. Audrey looked toward the city skyline beyond her office window. How does he seem? Calm. Michael smiled faintly. Mostly concerned that his shoes aren't polished enough. Audrey closed her eyes for a brief second. Exactly what I expected. She picked up the folded paper bag she had quietly kept inside her desk drawer all week. It was slightly wrinkled now but still carried the memory of that afternoon in the park. Bring him into the conference room first, she said. 5 minutes. Garrett followed another employee through a hallway lined with photographs celebrating decades of company history. They stopped outside a pair of tall wooden doors. Someone will be with you shortly. Garrett entered alone. The conference room overlooked nearly the entire city. A long table stretched across the room, surrounded by empty chairs. He sat quietly near the middle, placing his resume neatly in front of him. He glanced once at the framed company mission statement on the wall. We nourish lives with integrity. The words made him smile. They reminded him of something his wife used to say. The door opened behind him. Garrett stood politely, expecting a hiring manager. Instead, Michael Carter entered first, followed by a woman wearing an elegant navy business suit. Garrett looked at her face. His expression remained puzzled for only a heartbeat. Then recognition slowly replaced confusion. The gray hoodie was gone. The tired eyes from the park now carried quiet confidence. Audrey Bennett stopped across the table and smiled gently. Before Garrett could say a single word, the office door opened again. Chloe, who had been invited after school under the excuse of joining her father for lunch, stepped inside holding Mrs. Henderson's hand. She looked directly at Audrey, gasped with delighted surprise, and exclaimed, Dad, it's the hungry lady from the park. Silence filled the room as Garrett finally understood that the stranger who had accepted his last meal was not simply a woman in need, but the CEO of the company standing before him. No one spoke for several long seconds after Chloe's joyful voice echoed through the conference room. Garrett looked from Audrey to Michael and back again, trying to reconcile the memory of the woman in the gray hoodie with the confident executive standing before him. Audrey broke the silence first. "Hello again, Garrett." Her smile was exactly the same as it had been in the park. Only everything around her had changed. Garrett shook his head slowly, almost laughing in disbelief. "You..." He searched for the right words but couldn't find them. "You own this company?" Audrey nodded gently. "Yes." Garrett glanced at Chloe, then back at Audrey. "I had no idea." "I know," Audrey replied. "That's why your kindness mattered." She invited Garrett and Chloe to sit at the long conference table. Michael quietly closed the doors, leaving the room completely private. Audrey placed the wrinkled paper bag on the polished table. Garrett recognized it immediately. "You kept it?" he asked. Audrey rested her hand on the bag. "I've attended international conferences, negotiated billion-dollar contracts, and received awards from business leaders around the world." She looked directly at Garrett. "But this is still the most valuable thing anyone has given me." Garrett lowered his eyes, embarrassed. "It was only a sandwich." Audrey smiled softly. "No." She shook her head. "It was your lunch." The room fell silent again. Chloe reached for her father's hand beneath the table. Audrey continued. "Michael investigated your background after we met." Garrett looked surprised but not offended. "I hope that wasn't inappropriate," Audrey added. Garrett smiled faintly. "Considering where I'm sitting, I suppose it makes sense." Audrey opened a folder containing his employment history. "For 11 years you've quietly helped people without asking for recognition. You returned lost money, refused rewards, covered coworkers' shifts, and raised your daughter with dignity despite circumstances that would have discouraged many people." Garrett shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I just did what I thought was right." Audrey nodded. "Exactly." She closed the folder. "Most people spend interviews convincing me they're exceptional." She paused before continuing. "You convinced me without ever knowing you were being observed." Garrett looked genuinely confused. "I don't understand why I'm here." Audrey folded her hands on the table. "Because Bennett Foods is creating a new position." Michael slid a document toward Garrett. Across the top were the words, "Director of Community Partnerships." Garrett blinked twice before reading the title again. "There must be some mistake." Audrey smiled. "There isn't." Garrett looked from the document back to her. "I've never managed a department." "You know how to manage trust," Audrey replied. "I've never spoken in front of investors." "You know how to speak to people who need compassion." Garrett slowly shook his head. "I'm not qualified." Audrey leaned forward slightly. "Garrett, skills can be taught. Experience can be gained. Integrity cannot." She took a quiet breath. "Our company feeds millions of families every year. I can hire executives with impressive resumes." Her eyes softened. "Finding someone who will give away his own lunch to a stranger without expecting anything in return is far more difficult." Tears gathered in Chloe's eyes before they appeared in Garrett's. Audrey pushed the offer letter gently across the table. "This position includes full benefits, a salary that will comfortably support your family, flexible hours, leadership training, and one responsibility above all others." Garrett looked up. "What's that?" Audrey smiled with quiet certainty. "Help us remember that every meal we produce is for a human being, not a statistic." Garrett stared at the offer in front of him, then at the folded paper bag resting beside it. One represented a future he had never imagined. The other reminded him of a choice he would have made exactly the same way, even if this day had never come. 6 months later, the wooden bench in the little city park looked exactly the same. Autumn had returned, painting the maple trees in shades of gold and crimson, while children chased leaves across the grass with the same carefree laughter that had filled the air the year before. Garrett Sullivan sat beside Chloe, unpacking lunch from a simple canvas bag. Some traditions, he believed, should never disappear simply because life had become easier. Chloe smiled as she helped arrange everything on the bench. This time there were 3 sandwiches instead of 1. 3 apples instead of 1. 3 bottles of water lined up neatly beside them. Garrett noticed her counting. 3? He asked with a smile. Chloe nodded. Just in case. Garrett looked toward the food cart where their story had quietly begun. Just in case someone needs one, she said. He smiled proudly. Exactly. Across town, Bennett Foods had changed in ways no annual report could fully measure. Garrett had accepted Audrey's offer, not because of the salary or the title, but because she had convinced him that kindness could become part of a company's culture instead of remaining only a personal choice. Under his leadership, the Community Partnerships Division launched neighborhood meal programs, school pantry initiatives, and employee volunteer projects across dozens of cities. Every proposal Garrett approved began with the same question. Will this help someone feel seen? Audrey often smiled whenever she heard him ask it. During one executive meeting, a board member had once remarked, "Our community reputation has never been stronger." Audrey quietly corrected him. "Neither has our character." She never mentioned the paper bag resting safely inside the top drawer of her desk. It remained there as a private reminder that the company's greatest lesson had not come from a business school or a strategy meeting, but from a father sitting on a weathered park bench. That afternoon, Audrey walked through the park wearing ordinary clothes again, not to test anyone this time, but simply to enjoy the peaceful afternoon. Garrett noticed her first, and stood with an easy smile. "Hello, Audrey." "Hello, Garrett." Chloe ran over carrying one of the extra sandwiches. "You're just in time," she announced proudly. Audrey laughed. "Am I?" Chloe nodded with complete confidence. "Dad says there's always room for one more person." Audrey accepted the sandwich, then looked at Garrett. "You know," she said softly, "you changed my company." Garrett shook his head. "No." He glanced at Chloe before continuing. "We changed each other." Audrey smiled because she knew he was right. Wealth had allowed her to build a successful business. One ordinary afternoon had taught her how to build something far more meaningful. As the 3 of them shared lunch beneath the falling leaves, another woman approached the food cart with a worried expression, searching through her purse for enough coins. Before the vendor could say a word, Chloe quietly picked up the 3rd sandwich and walked toward her. Garrett watched without calling her back. Audrey watched without offering instructions. Neither needed to. Some lessons are taught through words. The most important ones are simply repeated. Garrett looked toward his daughter, as she handed the meal to the stranger with the same gentle smile he had worn months before. He realized that kindness had done something remarkable. It had not ended with the person who received it. It had quietly continued through the person who witnessed it. And perhaps that is how the world changes, not through grand speeches or extraordinary wealth, but through ordinary people choosing, again and again, to share what little they have with someone who needs it more. Because the most valuable meal is never the one placed on your own table. It is the one that reminds another person they are not alone.